All right, guys. Um, I'm going to try and pick up kind of where we left off, but also giving you a little bit of a refresher because we haven't talked about this in 2 weeks. Right now in World War One, Russia is about to withdraw from the war. They're withdrawing from the war because they're so short on supplies. Okay, Russia's in a hard time right now. We've talked about Russia. You guys know that most of Russia is focused. The population is in the western part of Russia. Now, that's where all the fighting is going. So Russia starts to withdraw from the war. They do this because they're having their own revolution. Vladimir Lenin's about to take over, and they're about to become a socialist country, a communist country under Lenin. Now, what that means for Germany, think about our map. If Germany doesn't have to fight Russia on the Eastern Front, that means they only have to focus on the Western Front. That's good for them. But the only problem is the United States is just now getting in the war. Okay, we initially send 14,000 troops over, which definitely stifles the German military, but we end up sending 2 million troops over. That's you can't fight against that. You have a group of German soldiers who have been fighting in a war for years, and now you have a new rejuvenated ally force with 2 million troops in it. A lot of the Central Powers kind of see the writing on the wall and they start to withdraw. Uh, in November of 1918, Kaiser Wilhelm actually steps down, and a new member of the German government comes in and signs an armistice. Okay, um, do we know what an armistice is? If we were in class, I would ask you that, but we're not. So I'm just going to tell you. An armistice is a ceasefire. An armistice is not a peace treaty. An armistice basically says that we're going to stop fighting for now. Now, the cool part about this, and I want you to backburner this idea. The new member of the Russian government, you don't need to know his name, he signs this armistice in a train car in Paris. That train car is going to become relevant later on. Okay, so we've talked about food shortages. You can look at this on your own. I know we talked about it in class. We also talked about the lasting legacy. Um, we're going to talk about this a little bit more today. Okay, and we've talked about the GDP. So, what does the end of the war look like? That's kind of where we're at. We signed an armistice, but an armistice is not a peace treaty. So, at the Paris Peace Conference, this is where the Allied powers actually come and sit down and they talk about what this peace treaty is going to look like. In the peace treaty, at the Paris Peace Conference, there are 32 countries that are represented there. Now, all 32 of those countries want to say in what the peace treaty looks like. However, there's really four. We call them the big four that matter, and they look like this. Okay, you have David Lloyd George. He's from Britain. George Clemenceau from France. Woodrow Wilson from the United States. Look at that top hat. And Vittorio Orlando from Italy. Now, I told you that Italy doesn't have a big say here. They are technically still considered part of the big four. So just hold on to that thought. So in January of 1919, these peace talks begin. Uh, Russia isn't represented. And notice that they're not part of the Big Four. They're not part of the Big Four right here. They're not there because they're going through their own revolution right now. They're not worried about World War One anymore. They have their own things going on. They opted out of the meeting. So Woodrow Wilson actually walks into this meeting with his idea of lasting peace in the world, and he actually calls them his 14 points. They include a lot of things. Some of his ideas, he basically walked in with a list of 14 bullet points. This is his idea. He thought that secret treaties should kind of come to an end. He believed that all militaries, and this is everyone, not just him, not just Germany, should reduce the size of their military. We're talking soldiers, we're talking spending, we're talking navy, army, all that good stuff. He also talked about fairness in colonies, and that colonies should have a say on who is going to rule them. That's a totally different idea than what we talked about during imperialism. That's actually a 180-degree turn for what we talked about imperialism. But that idea of colonies getting a say in who runs them is actually called self-determination. You're going to see that in italicized on the slide right there. Okay, he really believes that. The last thing he actually said in one of his 14 points is that maybe we need to change the borders in these countries. Remember, this all started because Serbia wanted to incorporate Bosnia and Herzegovina into their country. because they were ethnically similar. Who ended up taking them? The Austrian-Hungarian Empire. Okay, this whole thing could have been fixed if we had ethnically similar countries grouped together. Okay, um, that also falls into that self-determination point here. Okay, let people decide what government they want to live under. The very last thing that he really pushes for is this. I wrote general alliances. It really falls into what is known as the League of Nations. Okay, and this is a quote from him. He believes that the League of Nations should, quote, be a general association of nations that protect great and small states alike. Okay, does that sound like anything to you? A general association of nations that protects everyone? That might sound kind of like the United Nations. This was really the first shot at what we know today as the United Nations. Except then, in 1919, we call it the League of Nations. So, Woodrow Wilson has a lot of great ideas, except France and Germany weren't really interested in it. They weren't worried about what Woodrow Wilson had to say. They were really worried about Germany. They're the ones that share a continent with Germany, okay? Not the United States. So, France and Germany kind of had some different ideas. They wanted Germany's military to be the size of a peanut, all right? They wanted it to be very small. They wanted to never have to worry about Germany again. So, at the Treaty of Versailles, it was finally signed in June 28th, 1919. Okay, that was exactly 5 years after the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand. What does the final treaty look like? The League of Nations did actually exist. The League of Nations was set up, and it was to serve as an alliance for all of the countries for each other. They weren't supposed to fight with each other anymore. Now, Germany's territories in Africa and the Pacific were taken away from them. They were now under control of the League of Nations. The League of Nations and the Allied powers would decide when all of those colonies would be ready to rule, as in, they were going to milk them for all the money they could until they were forced to give them up. Okay, so Germany lost a lot of territory. Their military is severely limited going forward. But one of the biggest things that happens is right here, and it's called the War Guilt Clause. Okay, the War Guilt Clause is kind of what it sounds like. The War Guilt Clause means that they take sole responsibility for World War One, and because they take responsibility for it, they have to pay back all of the cost of World War One. In today's money, that would be $269 billion. That's a crippling amount of money. That's that's a really big problem. At the time, that's what was fair. That's what happened. It would take Germany 92 years to pay that back. Why did it take 92 years? Because 15% of their men just died in war. All of their industries were pretty much shut down from the war or destroyed. They don't have anyone to go to work. And when you have to pay back that exorbitant amount of money, that becomes a problem. That becomes a really big problem. So Germany loses a lot. A lot of countries all negotiate their own treaties with each other. With each other. So, for example, Austria-Hungarian Empire, they actually break down. They lose a lot of their land, and they become the countries that we know today as Austria, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, and what used to be known as Yugoslavia. And just a side note, because Russia left the war early, they actually lost some land too. So they gave up some land, and that land that was created now becomes Poland, Finland, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. All right, so now we have peace. Germany has a lot of money to pay back, and everything is good to go, right? Like World War One should be over. But you guys know World War Two is a thing. So obviously this peace treaty doesn't last long, okay? Remember I told you, we talked about this. Okay, remember I told you that Woodrow Wilson had 14 points? We literally called them Woodrow Wilson's 14 points. Well, the problem with this idea is that the way the US government is set up, the US Senate actually has to approve the peace treaty. And the US Senate does not approve the Treaty of Versailles. They do not pass the peace treaty. we didn't accept the terms. So even though Woodrow Wilson had all of these great ideas and the treaty was developed and the US was one of the most powerful, influential countries at the time, we didn't accept the peace treaty. So the United States, never joined the League of Nations. Many Americans believe that it was the US best interest to actually stay out of European affairs, and that's why we never entered the League of Nations. It wasn't our job. We didn't see it as our role. That's why we didn't get involved in the first place. So the United States, we would eventually sign our own separate treaty with Germany and all of the other countries, but we never signed the Treaty of Versailles. We never joined the League of Nations. Now remember, the League of Nations' job was to create an alliance and for people to protect themselves from each other. The US is one of the most powerful countries at the time. So if there's no one to protect the League of Nations doesn't become a very strong entity in itself. The League of Nations needed the United States to be legitimate, and they just never were. All right, so if you're Germany at this time, think about it for a second. You have to pay back billions of dollars. You lost a war. How do you feel? You're probably really annoyed. You're probably really salty. You're probably really angry. Remember that feeling, okay? It's going to become important later. All right, but there's another group of people that are also really bitter, and those people that are bitter are the colonies. They just went from being ruled by Germany to now being ruled by Allied powers. Those Allied powers get to decide when that colony can become independent. Remember, in history, if you ever get lost, follow the money. The Allies just shifted to controlling the colonies. Where's the money going? Straight to the colonies. Just a side note, Japan and Italy, they got into the war because they thought they were going to gain land during a peace treaty. Neither of them gained land, okay? Japan and Italy got nothing of substance after the Treaty of Versailles was signed. They got nothing from their peace treaty. It was really a waste for both of them. All right, so that's pretty much the end of World War I. We start with Europe looking like this on the left, okay? You have your Central Powers, remember your sandwich. You have your Central Powers, you have your Allied powers, and the United States joins later. And at the end of World War I, over here on the right, that's what Europe looks like. Austria-Hungary is dissolved, Germany significantly shrinks, Russia loses some land, France stays the same, Switzerland's always doing its own thing, all right? The post-World War I map of Europe is totally different than where we started. Okay? Just remember, there's a lot of people that walk away from this war that are still very upset with how it went.